Pastor David finds a black child abandoned in a trash can near the church. Years later, he discovers the boy's true identity, leaving him completely shocked. How will this stunning discovery change everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Pastor David Lockhart's footsteps echoed softly on the sidewalk as he made his way to the church on a warm summer afternoon. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of Silver Springs. As he approached the familiar white steeple, a faint sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be a stray cat, but as he drew closer to the church steps, the sound became clearer. It was unmistakably the cry of a baby. Pastor David's heart raced as he quickened his pace. His eyes scanned the area, searching for the source of the cries. Then he saw it. A trash can near the church steps was slightly askew, and the cries were coming from inside. With trembling hands, Pastor David lifted the lid. His breath caught in his throat as he saw a tiny black baby boy, no more than a few days old, wrapped in a thin blanket. Tears welled up in his eyes as he gently lifted the infant from the trash can. "Oh, sweet child," he whispered, cradling the baby close to his chest. "Who could have left you here?" As he held the baby, Pastor David noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into the blanket. With one hand still supporting the infant, he carefully unfolded the note and began to read. The words on the page made his heart ache. The mother, facing a terminal illness, had made the heart-wrenching decision to leave her baby where she knew he would be found and cared for. She expressed her hope that the church would take him in and give him the love and care she couldn't provide. At the bottom of the note, there was a mention of the baby's father. The mother hadn't named him but described a unique necklace he wore, the same necklace she had left with the baby. Pastor David's eyes fell on the small pendant hanging from a delicate chain around the infant's neck. Tears streamed down Pastor David's face as he looked at the innocent child in his arms. Without a moment's hesitation, he knew what he had to do. "Don't you worry, little one," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll take care of you. You're safe now." As he walked into the church, holding the baby close, Pastor David's mind was already racing with plans. He would need supplies, help from the congregation, and so much more. But one thing was certain: this child would have a home and a family. "Isaiah," he whispered, the name coming to him like a divine inspiration. "Your name will be Isaiah, and you will be loved, my son." Pastor David's decision to raise Isaiah as his own son came naturally, as if guided by a higher power. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but his faith and love for the child gave him strength. As he cradled the infant in his arms, he made a silent promise to provide Isaiah with all the love and care he deserved. The news of Isaiah's arrival spread quickly through the tight-knit community of Silver Springs. The church congregation rallied around Pastor David and the baby, offering support in every way they could. Church members took turns bringing meals, donating baby supplies, and helping with childcare. Mrs. Johnson, a retired nurse, became Isaiah's unofficial grandmother, always ready with advice and a helping hand. Mr. Thompson, the local carpenter, crafted a beautiful crib for the baby. The entire community embraced Isaiah as one of their own, showering him with love and attention. As the days turned into weeks, Pastor David found himself captivated by the mystery surrounding Isaiah's origins. He often held the unique necklace left with the baby, studying its intricate design. It was a simple silver chain with a small, oddly shaped pendant that seemed to shimmer in the light. "Who are you?" Pastor David would whisper, running his thumb over the pendant. "And why did you leave your son?" The unanswered questions weighed heavily on his heart. He wondered about Isaiah's father. Was he aware he had a son? What circumstances had led to such a heartbreaking decision to abandon the child? Pastor David's mind conjured up various scenarios, each more poignant than the last. Despite the lingering questions, Pastor David focused on providing Isaiah with a loving home. He cherished every moment with the boy, from late-night feedings to quiet afternoons, rocking him to sleep. As Isaiah grew, his bright smile and infectious laughter filled the church with joy, touching the hearts of everyone who met him. As the years passed, Isaiah grew into a happy, energetic child who captured the hearts of everyone in Silver Springs. His infectious laughter echoed through the church halls, and his kind nature touched all who met him. The townspeople doted on him, always eager to see his bright smile and hear about his latest adventures. Isaiah's natural charm and genuine warmth made him a favorite among the congregation. Mrs. Johnson would bake him special cookies for Sunday school, while Mr. Thompson taught him how to build birdhouses in his workshop. The boy's presence seemed to bring out the best in everyone around him. Pastor David watched with pride as Isaiah blossomed. The child's curiosity and zest for life were a constant source of joy. Whether he was helping to arrange flowers for the altar or enthusiastically participating in church picnics, Isaiah's presence was a blessing to the community. Despite the happiness Isaiah brought, Pastor David couldn't help but wonder about the boy's origins. The mystery of the necklace left with Isaiah as a baby continued to intrigue him. Sometimes, late at night, he would take out the silver pendant and study it, hoping for some clue about Isaiah's parents. The unique design of the necklace was unlike anything Pastor David had seen before. He often found himself lost in thought, imagining the story behind it. Who was Isaiah's father? Did he know about his son? These questions lingered in Pastor David's mind, but he kept them to himself. Instead of dwelling on the unknowns, Pastor David chose to focus on providing Isaiah with all the love and care he could offer. He cherished their father-son bond, savoring simple moments like reading bedtime stories or teaching Isaiah to ride a bike. The pastor's love for Isaiah grew deeper with each passing day, reinforcing his commitment to giving the boy the best life possible. Isaiah, now a bright-eyed 10-year-old, had become an eager helper around the church. His infectious enthusiasm and willingness to lend a hand made him a beloved fixture in the Silver Springs community. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Isaiah bustled about the church grounds, tidying up after the morning service. As he swept the front steps, a weary traveler approached. The man, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, smiled warmly at Isaiah. "Hello there, young man. Is this the Silver Springs Community Church?" Isaiah beamed, his chest swelling with pride. "Yes, sir. Can I help you with anything?" The traveler nodded gratefully. "I was hoping to rest for a bit before continuing my journey. Would that be all right?" "Of course," Isaiah exclaimed. "Please come inside. I'll get you some water." As Isaiah led the man into the cool interior of the church, Pastor David emerged from his office. He greeted the traveler with a welcoming handshake. "Welcome to Silver Springs. I'm Pastor David, and I see you've already met our young Isaiah." The traveler's eyes widened as he caught sight of the necklace hanging around Isaiah's neck. "My word," he breathed, leaning in for a closer look. "That's quite a remarkable piece you have there, young man." Isaiah's hand instinctively went to the pendant. "Thank you," he said shyly. "It was my mom's." The traveler's interest was piqued. "May I?" he asked, gesturing towards the necklace. With a nod from Pastor David, Isaiah carefully lifted it over his head and handed it to the man. As the traveler examined the intricate design, his eyes lit up with recognition. "This is truly extraordinary," he murmured. "I've only seen a handful of these in my travels. They're incredibly rare and often have significant family history attached to them." Pastor David's ears perked up at this information. The seed of curiosity that had long laid dormant in his mind began to sprout anew. "Is that so?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "What can you tell us about it?" The traveler handed the necklace back to Isaiah with reverence. "Well, from what I understand, these necklaces are often passed down through generations. They're not just jewelry, but symbols of heritage and identity. Each one tells a unique story of the family it belongs to." As Isaiah carefully put the necklace back on, Pastor David's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be the key to unlocking the mystery of Isaiah's past? The questions he had pushed aside for so long came flooding back, demanding answers. Pastor David watched as Isaiah chatted animatedly with the traveler, his heart swelling with love for the boy he had raised as his own. As the conversation about the necklace faded, The weight of the mystery surrounding Isaiah's origins settled heavily on Pastor David's shoulders once again. That evening, after tucking Isaiah into bed, Pastor David retreated to his study. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was the letter Isaiah's mother had left with him all those years ago. With trembling hands, he unfolded the paper and began to read. "To whoever finds my precious boy," the letter began. Pastor David's eyes misted as he recalled the day he had discovered Isaiah, a tiny bundle of hope abandoned in a trash can. The words on the page blurred as he continued reading, his heart aching for the mother who had been forced to make such an impossible choice. As he scanned the letter, searching for any clue about Isaiah's father, Pastor David found himself at a loss. The only mention was the vague reference to the necklace, a detail that now seemed both tantalizingly close and frustratingly out of reach. Sighing deeply, Pastor David folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. He leaned back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of questions and doubts. Should he pursue this mystery further? What if the truth brought pain to Isaiah? After a long moment of contemplation, Pastor David made a decision. He would set aside his curiosity for now and focus on what truly mattered, raising Isaiah to be the kind, compassionate young man he was already becoming. As Isaiah entered his teenage years, his kind heart and natural leadership abilities continued to shine. The community of Silver Springs watched with pride as the young man they had all helped raise blossomed into an exceptional individual. At the church's community center, Isaiah could often be found organizing food drives, tutoring younger children, or simply lending a sympathetic ear to those in need. His warm smile and genuine compassion touched everyone he encountered. One crisp autumn afternoon, Isaiah was helping Mrs. Wilson, an elderly widow, carry her groceries home. As they walked, she patted his arm affectionately. "You're such a blessing, Isaiah," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Pastor David must be so proud of the young man you've become." Isaiah's smile faltered slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I hope I'm making him proud." As they reached her front porch, Isaiah's curiosity got the better of him. "Mrs. Wilson, did you know my parents? My birth parents?" The old woman's face softened with sympathy. "Oh, sweetie, I'm afraid I don't know much about them. But I do know that Pastor David loves you as if you were his own flesh and blood." Isaiah nodded, a familiar ache settling in his chest. He helped Mrs. Wilson inside with her groceries, then made his way back to the church, lost in thought. That evening, as Pastor David was tidying up his study, Isaiah appeared in the doorway, his expression serious. "Pastor David, can we talk?" he asked hesitantly. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Pastor David replied, gesturing for Isaiah to take a seat. Isaiah fidgeted with his necklace, a habit he had developed over the years. "I was wondering, could you tell me more about my birth parents? I know you found me, but there must be something else you know." Pastor David's heart clenched at the longing in Isaiah's voice. He took a deep breath, knowing this moment would come eventually. Pastor David looked at Isaiah with a mix of love and concern. He knew this moment would change everything, but he also knew it was time for the truth. "Isaiah," he began softly, "there's something I need to tell you about the day I found you." Pastor David recounted the events of that fateful afternoon, his voice filled with emotion. He described hearing the faint cry, finding the baby in the trash can, and the heartbreaking note left by Isaiah's mother. Isaiah listened intently, his eyes widening with each revelation. His hand unconsciously gripped the necklace around his neck as Pastor David explained that her mother left the necklace to him. "Your mother left it with you," Pastor David said gently. Tears welled up in Isaiah's eyes. "She was sick and she left me here?" Pastor David nodded, reaching out to squeeze Isaiah's shoulder. "She wanted you to have a chance at a good life, son. She knew she couldn't provide that for you." Isaiah sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing the information. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you for telling me, Pastor David. And thank you for everything you've done for me." Pastor David pulled Isaiah into a tight hug, his own eyes misting over. "You've been a blessing to me, Isaiah. Never doubt that. As they pulled apart, Isaiah fingered his necklace thoughtfully. So this is all I have left of them? Pastor David nodded. The necklace, once just a piece of jewelry, now felt heavy with meaning. Isaiah continued to wear the necklace every day, its weight a constant reminder of the mystery surrounding his birth. As he went about his volunteer work at the church's community center, he found himself lost in thought more often than usual. The unanswered questions about his father's identity tugged at his mind, distracting him from his tasks. One afternoon, while helping to sort donations for the food bank, Isaiah fumbled with a box of canned goods. The cans clattered to the floor, startling him out of his reverie. "You okay there, Isaiah?" Mrs. Johnson, a regular volunteer, asked with concern. Isaiah forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine, just a little clumsy today." But he wasn't fine. The burden of his unknown past weighed heavily on his heart. He finished his shift at the community center, his movements mechanical as his mind wandered to thoughts of his father. Who was he? Did he know about Isaiah? Why hadn't he been there? Later that evening, Pastor David found Isaiah sitting alone on the church steps, absently fiddling with his necklace. The older man sat down beside him, his presence comforting and familiar. "Something on your mind, son?" Pastor David asked gently. Isaiah sighed. "I can't stop thinking about my father." Pastor David put an arm around Isaiah's shoulders. "I understand your frustration, Isaiah. It's natural to want answers about where you come from." Isaiah looked up at the man who had raised him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if knowing changes everything? What if he doesn't want me?" Pastor David's voice was firm but kind. "Listen to me, Isaiah. Your true worth isn't determined by your past or by who your father might be. It's determined by the person you've become, the kind, generous young man I see before me." As Isaiah turned 18, the small town of Silver Springs celebrated his high school graduation with pride. The community center buzzed with excitement, decorated with balloons and streamers for the party they'd thrown in his honor. Isaiah stood near the punch bowl, his necklace glinting under the fluorescent lights as he chatted with well-wishers. Pastor David watched from across the room, his heart swelling with love and pride. He remembered the tiny baby he'd found all those years ago and marveled at the young man Isaiah had become. As he approached Isaiah, he overheard Mrs. Johnson gushing about Isaiah's plans. "So, what's next for our star volunteer?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Isaiah smiled warmly. "I'm staying right here in Silver Springs. This community has given me so much. It's time I give back full time." Pastor David placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "We're blessed to have you, son." Later that evening, as they cleaned up the community center, Isaiah turned to Pastor David. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about my birth parents lately." Pastor David's heart skipped a beat. "Oh?" Isaiah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've decided to let it go. My real family is right here. You, the church, this town. I don't need to know about my birth father to know who I am." Relief and pride washed over Pastor David. He pulled Isaiah into a tight hug, blinking back tears. "I'm so proud of you, Isaiah. You've grown into an incredible young man." As they finished cleaning, Pastor David watched Isaiah joke with some of the younger volunteers. He felt a mix of emotions, joy at Isaiah's decision, pride in the man he'd become, but also a nagging worry. He knew the truth about Isaiah's father could still come to light someday, and he prayed it wouldn't shatter the peace Isaiah had found. As summer faded into autumn, the town of Silver Springs buzzed with election fever. Campaign posters plastered storefronts, and lawn signs dotted the neatly trimmed yards. Mayor Jackson Lopez's face smiled down from billboards, his slogan, "Progress for Silver Springs," echoing through the streets. Isaiah, now working full-time at the community center, remained focused on his volunteer work. He walked past the election posters without a second glance, more concerned with the upcoming food drive than political promises. One crisp morning, as Isaiah sorted through donations, Pastor David stopped by. He watched Isaiah work, a fond smile on his face. "You know, son, It might be worth paying attention to the election. The mayor has a lot of influence over our community programs. Isaiah shrugged, not looking up from the canned goods he was organizing. I'm sure it'll all work out, Pastor. People seem to like Mayor Lopez well enough. Pastor David nodded, but his eyes held a hint of worry. He'd been watching Lopez's campaign closely, attending town halls and reading up on his policies. Something about the mayor's polished demeanor made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. As Pastor David left the community center, he nearly bumped into Mayor Lopez himself. The mayor was shaking hands and kissing babies, his campaign team trailing behind him. Pastor David, Lopez called out, flashing his signature smile. I hope I can count on your support in the upcoming election. Pastor David forced a polite smile. I'm still considering all the candidates, Mayor Lopez, but I appreciate your dedication to our town. As they exchanged pleasantries, Pastor David couldn't help but notice the mayor's eyes darting to the community center behind him. For a moment, Lopez's confident facade seemed to slip, revealing a flicker of, was it recognition? Guilt? But before Pastor David could ponder it further, the mask was back in place. Well, I must be going, Lopez said, his voice slightly strained. Lots of hands to shake, you know how it is. As the mayor moved on, Pastor David stood rooted to the spot, a strange feeling settling in his stomach. He watched Lopez's retreating figure, unable to shake the sense that something significant had just happened, though he couldn't quite grasp what it was. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot as people gathered on the church grounds for the annual fall festival. Pumpkins and hay bales decorated the area, and the scent of apple cider wafted through the air. Pastor David stood near the entrance, greeting attendees with a warm smile. Mayor Jackson Lopez arrived fashionably late, his campaign team in tow. He shook hands and posed for photos, his charismatic smile never faltering. As he made his way through the crowd, his eyes scanned the area, looking for influential community members to charm. Isaiah bustled about, his necklace glinting in the afternoon sun as he moved. He was in his element, helping to set up game booths and assisting elderly visitors to their seats. His infectious laugh and genuine warmth touched everyone he encountered. As Mayor Lopez approached the refreshment table, he found himself face to face with Isaiah, who was refilling the apple cider dispenser. Can I help you, sir? Isaiah asked, his smile bright and welcoming. The mayor felt an unexpected jolt, as if a current had passed between them. He blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Yes, thank you. Some cider would be lovely. Isaiah poured a cup and handed it to the mayor. There you go. Enjoy the festival, Mr. Mayor. As their hands briefly touched during the exchange, Lopez felt that strange connection again. He found himself staring at Isaiah, trying to place the familiar feeling that nagged at him. Have we met before? Lopez asked, his usual smooth demeanor slightly ruffled. Isaiah shook his head. I don't think so, sir. But I've seen you around town, of course. Everyone knows Mayor Lopez. The mayor nodded, still unable to shake the odd sensation. He watched as Isaiah turned to help an elderly woman who had spilled her drink, immediately captivated by the young man's kindness and quick action. Throughout the afternoon, Lopez found his eyes drawn to Isaiah again and again. He observed the young man's interactions with the community members, noting the genuine care and attention he gave to each person. It stirred something deep within the mayor, a mix of admiration and an emotion he couldn't quite name. As the event wound down, Lopez approached Pastor David. That young man, he said, gesturing towards Isaiah. He's quite remarkable. Pastor David beamed with pride. That's Isaiah. He's been a blessing to our community since he was a child. Mayor Lopez nodded, his eyes still following Isaiah as he helped clean up. He certainly seems to be. You must be very proud. As the fall festival began to wind down, Isaiah continued his tireless volunteer work, helping to clean up and ensuring every last visitor left with a smile. Mayor Lopez, still intrigued by the young man, found himself drawn to observe Isaiah more closely. The mayor watched as Isaiah effortlessly moved from task to task, his energy seemingly endless. There was something about the way he carried himself, the kindness in his eyes, that struck a chord deep within Lopez. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this connection than mere admiration. As Isaiah bent down to pick up a fallen banner, his necklace swung free from his shirt. The afternoon sun caught the metal, causing it to gleam brightly. Mayor Lopez's eyes widened in surprise. He took a few steps closer, his heart racing. "Excuse me, Isaiah," the mayor called out, his voice slightly shaky. "That necklace you're wearing, may I take a closer look?" Isaiah straightened up, a bit surprised by the request but happy to oblige. "Of course, Mr. Mayor," he said, holding the pendant out for Lopez to see. Mayor Lopez's breath caught in his throat as he examined the necklace. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached into his own shirt collar, pulling out an identical piece of jewelry. I can't believe it," Lopez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have the exact same necklace. It's a family heirloom, passed down through generations in my family." Isaiah's eyes grew wide with surprise. "Really? That's amazing." Nearby, Pastor David was helping to stack chairs when he overheard the exchange. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he turned to look at the mayor and Isaiah standing side by side, their identical necklaces glinting in the fading sunlight. The pastor's mind raced, recalling the note left with baby Isaiah all those years ago. The piece about the father having the same necklace suddenly took on a whole new meaning. He felt a mix of shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of realization as he watched the scene unfold before him. That night, Pastor David sat at his desk, the soft glow of his lamp illuminating the worn piece of paper in his hands. He read and reread the letter left with baby Isaiah, his eyes lingering on the words about the father's necklace. The pastor's heart raced as he remembered Mayor Lopez's identical pendant. "Could it be?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. Pastor David leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling with memories and possibilities. He thought of the day he found Isaiah, a tiny bundle left in the trash. He remembered the years of wondering about the boy's origins, and now, suddenly, a potential answer had appeared right before his eyes. The pastor closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The weight of this realization settled heavily on his shoulders. If Mayor Lopez was indeed Isaiah's biological father, what would that mean for everyone involved? How would this change Isaiah's life? And what about the mayor's political career? Pastor David's heart ached for Isaiah. The young man had grown up not knowing his birth parents, and now, the truth might be more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The pastor's protective instincts kicked in, making him want to shield Isaiah from any potential pain or disappointment. But as he sat there in the dim light, Pastor David knew he couldn't ignore this possibility. The necklaces were too unique, too specific to be a mere coincidence. He felt a mix of emotions, shock, worry, and a strange sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could bring some closure to Isaiah's story. Pastor David picked up the letter once more, his fingers tracing the faded ink. He knew he had a difficult decision to make. Should he confront Mayor Lopez with his suspicions? Should he tell Isaiah about this potential connection? The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, making his next steps feel impossibly important. Pastor David knew he couldn't ignore his suspicions. With a heavy heart, he decided to investigate Mayor Lopez's past discreetly. He started by reaching out to some of the older members of the community, people who had lived in Silver Springs for decades. Over cups of coffee and during casual conversations after church services, Pastor David carefully steered discussions towards the town's history. He listened intently, piecing together fragments of information about Mayor Lopez's earlier years. Mrs. Martinez, a retired schoolteacher, was the first to mention something interesting. "Oh, that Lopez boy," she said, shaking her head. "There was quite a stir about him years ago. Some sort of scandal, but it was all hushed up." This tidbit sparked Pastor David's curiosity even further. He gently pressed for more details, careful not to raise suspicions about his sudden interest in the mayor's past. As days turned into weeks, Pastor David uncovered more whispers and half-forgotten rumors. Mr. Willow, the former town clerk, recalled, "There was talk of an affair, you know. Never made the papers, but folks were gossiping about it for months. The pastor's heart raced at this revelation. Could this affair have resulted in Isaiah's birth? The timeline seemed to fit, but he needed more concrete evidence. He spent hours in the local library poring over old newspapers and town records. While he found no direct mention of the affair, he noticed a period where Mayor Lopez, then a rising politician, had suddenly withdrawn from public life for several months. With each new piece of information, Pastor David became more convinced of his theory. The necklace, the timing of the affair, Lopez's mysterious absence, it all seemed to point to one conclusion. Mayor Lopez was likely Isaiah's biological father. As the puzzle pieces fell into place, Pastor David felt a mix of emotions. He was relieved to finally have some answers, but he also felt the weight of this knowledge. What would he do with this information? How would it affect Isaiah, the young man he had raised and loved as his own son? Pastor David sat in his study, his Bible open before him, but his mind far from the scriptures. The weight of his recent discovery pressed heavily on his heart. He knew the truth about Isaiah's father, but the knowledge brought more questions than answers. "Lord, give me guidance," he whispered, his eyes closed in silent prayer. As he wrestled with his conscience, Pastor David couldn't help but think of Isaiah's bright smile and kind heart. The young man had grown into someone any father would be proud of. But would this revelation bring joy or pain to Isaiah's life? Outside his window, campaign posters for Mayor Lopez fluttered in the breeze. The mayor's face, confident and reassuring, seemed to mock Pastor David's inner turmoil. Lopez continued his re-election campaign, shaking hands and making promises, completely unaware of the bombshell that could shatter his carefully crafted public image. Pastor David sighed deeply. He knew that revealing the truth could change everything, not just for Isaiah, but for the entire town of Silver Springs. The scandal could rock the community to its core. Yet as he thought about Isaiah's lifelong search for identity, he wondered if keeping this secret was truly the right thing to do. Didn't Isaiah deserve to know his roots, to understand where he came from? The pastor's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at his door. It was Isaiah, dropping by with a fresh batch of cookies Mrs. Johnson had baked for the church potluck. "Hey, Pastor David," Isaiah said, his smile as warm as ever. "You okay? You look worried about something." Pastor David forced a smile. "Just thinking about some church matters, son. Nothing for you to worry about." As Isaiah chatted about his day, Pastor David's heart ached. How could he possibly tell this young man that his father was the very mayor he'd been volunteering for? That the man whose campaign posters covered the town was the one who had left him in a trash can all those years ago? The burden of knowledge weighed heavily on Pastor David's shoulders. He knew he had to make a decision soon, but for now, he simply listened to Isaiah, cherishing these moments of innocent happiness before the storm he feared was coming. Isaiah bustled around the community center, his energy seemingly endless as he moved from task to task. He wiped down tables, organized donation boxes, and greeted everyone with his signature warm smile. The center had become like a second home to him, a place where he could make a real difference in people's lives. "Isaiah, you're a godsend," Mrs. Thompson said as she watched him help an elderly man to his seat. "I don't know what we'd do without you here." Isaiah blushed at the compliment. "Oh, it's nothing, Mrs. Thompson. I just like helping out where I can." As Isaiah continued his work, Mayor Lopez walked into the center, his campaign smile plastered on his face. But as soon as he saw Isaiah, something in his expression changed. His smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of confusion and unease. "Good afternoon, Mayor Lopez," Isaiah called out cheerfully. "Here for the lunch program?" Lopez nodded, his eyes never leaving Isaiah. "Yes, I thought I'd stop by and see how things are going." As Isaiah led him through the center, explaining the various programs and services they offered, Lopez found himself more and more distracted. There was something about this young man that tugged at his heart, a familiarity he couldn't shake. "And over here we have our new computer lab," Isaiah was saying, his enthusiasm infectious. "It's been a real game changer for folks looking for jobs or trying to further their education." Lopez nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. He watched as Isaiah interacted with the people around him, his kindness and genuine care for others shining through in every interaction. It stirred something in Lopez, a mix of pride and shame that he couldn't quite understand. As the tour continued, Lopez felt increasingly uncomfortable. The way Isaiah's eyes crinkled when he smiled, the sound of his laugh, it all felt eerily familiar. And that necklace, identical to his own family heirloom, seemed to mock him from around Isaiah's neck. By the time they finished the tour, Lopez was visibly shaken. He made his excuses and left quickly, leaving Isaiah puzzled by the mayor's strange behavior. Pastor David paced in his study, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth he had uncovered. After days of inner turmoil, he knew it was time to confront Mayor Lopez. He picked up the phone and dialed the mayor's office, requesting an urgent private meeting. The next day, Pastor David found himself sitting across from Mayor Lopez in the mayor's plush office. The air was thick with tension as Pastor David cleared his throat. "Mayor Lopez, I appreciate you meeting with me on such short notice," Pastor David began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Lopez leaned back in his chair, eyeing the pastor curiously. "Of course, Pastor. What's this about?" Pastor David took a deep breath. "It's about Isaiah," he said, watching as Lopez's expression shifted from curiosity to unease. "I've noticed how you've been acting around him lately," Pastor David continued, "and I think I know why." Lopez shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm not sure I understand," he said, his voice tight. Pastor David reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter from Isaiah's mother. 18 years ago, a baby was left at our church. This letter was with him. He handed the letter to Lopez, who took it with trembling hands. As the mayor read, his face paled. "The necklace mentioned in the letter," Pastor David said softly. "It's identical to the one you wear, the one Isaiah wears." Lopez looked up, his eyes wide with shock and dawning realization. "I've done some digging," Pastor David continued. "The timing matches up with certain rumors from back then." Lopez slumped in his chair, the letter falling from his hands. I had no idea," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Pastor David leaned forward, his eyes filled with compassion but also determination. "Mayor Lopez, I believe you are Isaiah's father." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Lopez buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. "What do you want from me?" Lopez asked, his voice muffled. Pastor David's tone was gentle but firm. "The truth, Mayor. Isaiah deserves to know where he comes from, and you have a chance to make things right." Mayor Lopez's face contorted with a mix of shock and disbelief. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is preposterous," he sputtered, pacing behind his desk. "I can't be Isaiah's father. It's impossible." Pastor David remained calm, his eyes following the agitated mayor. "Jackson," he said softly, using the mayor's first name, "I know this is a lot to take in, but please, look at the facts." Lopez stopped pacing and leaned against his desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge. "Do you have any idea what this could do to my career? To my family?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pastor David nodded solemnly. "I understand the stakes, Mayor, but there's a young man out there who deserves to know the truth about where he comes from." Lopez's shoulders sagged as the weight of the situation bore down on him. He picked up the letter again, his hands shaking as he reread it. "The necklace," he murmured almost to himself. "I remember giving one just like it to a woman I knew back then." He looked up at Pastor David, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and dawning realization. "But I never knew. She never told me." Pastor David leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "It's not too late to make things right, Jackson. Isaiah is an incredible young man. Getting to know him could be a blessing in your life." Lopez sank back into his chair, conflict etched across his face. "But my re-election campaign, my reputation, everything I've worked for." "I know it's a difficult decision," Pastor David said, "but think about what's truly important. Is your political career worth more than acknowledging your own son? Lopez buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. I need time to think, he said, his voice hoarse. It's too much to process all at once. Pastor David nodded understandingly. Take the time you need, Mayor, but please don't take too long. Isaiah deserves to know the truth, and the longer we wait, the harder it will be for everyone involved. Mayor Lopez paced nervously in his office, his hands clasped behind his back. His closest advisor, Mina, sat in a chair watching him with concern. Mina, I need your advice, Lopez said, his voice strained. Something's come up that could change everything. Mina leaned forward, her brow furrowed. What is it, Jackson? Lopez took a deep breath and began to explain. He told her about Pastor David's visit, the evidence pointing to Isaiah being his son, and the growing guilt that gnawed at him. I can't stop thinking about it, Lopez admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. That young man, he could be my flesh and blood, and I've been ignoring him all this time. Mina listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each word. When Lopez finished, she stood up and placed a hand on his shoulder. Jackson, you need to think carefully about this, she said, her tone cautious. If this gets out, it could ruin everything we've worked for. Your re-election campaign would be over before it even begins. Lopez nodded, his face etched with worry. I know, but how can I just ignore this? It doesn't feel right. Mina sighed, her voice softening. Look, I understand you feel guilty, but think about the bigger picture. You've done so much good for this town. If you lose the election, all of that progress could be undone. Lopez walked to the window, staring out at the town he'd sworn to serve. But at what cost, Mina? Can I really keep this secret buried? You have to, Mina insisted. For the good of Silver Springs, for your family, for your legacy. Lopez turned back to her, conflict clear in his eyes. But what about Isaiah? Doesn't he deserve to know the truth? Mina shook her head firmly. The truth could destroy more than just your career, Jackson. It could hurt Isaiah too. He has a good life with Pastor David. Why complicate that? Lopez slumped into his chair, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew Mina was right about the potential consequences, but he couldn't shake the image of Isaiah from his mind. I don't know if I can keep living with this secret, he confessed, his voice heavy with emotion. It's eating me up inside. Mina knelt beside him, her voice gentle but firm. You have to, Jackson, for everyone's sake. We'll find a way to make it right someday, but for now, we need to keep this quiet. Lopez nodded slowly, but the guilt in his eyes remained. He was torn between his political ambitions and the growing need to acknowledge the truth about his son. Pastor David knelt by his bedside, his hands clasped tightly together. The weight of the secret he carried pressed heavily on his heart. He closed his eyes and began to pray, his voice barely above a whisper. Lord, I need your guidance, he pleaded. What should I do about Isaiah and Mayor Lopez? The pastor's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, he felt a deep responsibility to protect Isaiah, the boy he had raised as his own for 18 years. The thought of disrupting Isaiah's life with such shocking news filled him with dread. But on the other hand, Pastor David believed firmly in the power of truth. He had always taught his congregation that honesty was the foundation of a righteous life. How could he preach about integrity if he kept such a monumental secret? Father, he continued, his voice cracking with emotion, I believe Mayor Lopez needs to take responsibility for his son. But at what cost? He thought about Isaiah's kind heart and gentle spirit. The boy had grown into a fine young man, always putting others before himself. Pastor David worried that learning the truth about his father might shatter Isaiah's world. Yet as he prayed, Pastor David couldn't shake the feeling that keeping this secret was wrong. He had raised Isaiah to face life's challenges with courage and faith. Perhaps this was just another test of character for the young man. Lord, give me the wisdom to know what's right, Pastor David whispered, and the strength to do it, no matter how difficult it may be. As he continued to pray, tears rolled down his cheeks. The love he felt for Isaiah was immeasurable, and the thought of causing him pain was almost unbearable. But Pastor David also knew that sometimes the path to healing and growth could be painful. He opened his eyes and looked at the framed photo of Isaiah on his nightstand. The boy's bright smile seemed to shine even in the dim light of the bedroom. Pastor David's heart ached with the weight of his decision. "Whatever happens," he said softly, touching the frame, "I'll be there for you, Isaiah. Always." Mayor Lopez paced nervously outside the church, his heart pounding in his chest. He had called Isaiah for a private meeting, and now the moment of truth was upon him. As he saw the young man approaching, Lopez took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Good afternoon, Mayor Lopez," Isaiah greeted him with a warm smile. "Is everything okay? You sounded worried on the phone." Lopez nodded, his throat tight. "Let's go inside, Isaiah. We need to talk." They entered the empty church, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Isaiah looked confused but followed the mayor to a pew near the front. As they sat down, Lopez clasped his hands together, his knuckles turning white. "Isaiah," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have something very important to tell you. It's about your parents." Isaiah's eyes widened. "My parents? What do you know about them?" Lopez felt a lump form in his throat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a necklace identical to the one Isaiah wore. "Do you recognize this?" Isaiah nodded slowly, touching his own necklace. "It's just like mine. But how?" "Isaiah," Lopez said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm your father." The words hung in the air between them. Isaiah stared at Lopez, shock written all over his face. "What? How is that possible?" Lopez took a shaky breath. "Many years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I had an affair with a woman, your mother. She never told me she was pregnant, protecting my image. She left. I was so focused on my career." Tears began to form in Isaiah's eyes as Lopez continued. "I didn't know she was sick. I didn't know she would—" His voice broke. "I'm so sorry, Isaiah. I should have been there for you. I should have taken responsibility." Isaiah sat in stunned silence, trying to process the revelation. Lopez reached out, hesitating before placing a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "I know this is a shock. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed you to know the truth." Isaiah sat frozen, his mind reeling from the revelation. The church suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. He stared at Mayor Lopez, searching for any resemblance, any sign that this man could be his father. The matching necklaces seemed to mock him, a tangible reminder of the connection he never knew existed. I don't understand," Isaiah finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, you knew? And you never said anything?" Mayor Lopez's shoulders slumped, the weight of his confession visible in every line of his face. "I didn't know at first, Isaiah, but when I saw your necklace, I was shocked, when I heard about how you were found and Pastor David reached out." Isaiah stood up abruptly, needing to move to do something with the overwhelming emotions coursing through him. "How could you abandon us? How could you just leave?" "I was young and ambitious," Lopez admitted, his voice filled with regret. "I thought my political career was everything. I convinced myself it was better for everyone if I stayed away. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong." Isaiah paced back and forth, his hands clenched at his sides. "Do you know what it's like to grow up not knowing where you came from? To wonder every day why your parents didn't want you?" Lopez reached out, trying to bridge the gap between them. "Isaiah, please. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to make things right. I want to be part of your life now." But Isaiah stepped back, shaking his head. The anger and confusion swirling inside him were too much to bear. I can't do this right now. I need time to think." Without waiting for a response, Isaiah turned and hurried out of the church, leaving Mayor Lopez alone with his guilt and regret. The bright sunlight outside felt harsh and unforgiving as Isaiah stumbled down the steps, his mind in a fog. He wandered aimlessly through the streets of Silver Springs, the town he had always called home now feeling strange and unfamiliar. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about his life, had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. Isaiah's feet carried him to the only place he knew he could find solace, Pastor David's house. His heart pounded as he knocked on the familiar wooden door, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. Pastor David opened the door, his face etched with concern as he saw Isaiah's distressed state. "Isaiah, my boy, what's wrong?" Isaiah pushed past him, entering the cozy living room that had been a second home to him for so many years. He turned to face Pastor David, his voice trembling with emotion. "You knew, didn't you? You knew Mayor Lopez was my father." Pastor David's shoulders sagged as he nodded slowly. "I did, Isaiah, but I only found out recently." "Why didn't you tell me?" Isaiah demanded, his voice rising. "How could you keep something like this from me?" Pastor David gestured for Isaiah to sit down, his eyes filled with compassion. "I wanted to protect you, son. I needed time to process it myself and figure out the best way to tell you." Isaiah sank into the familiar armchair, his anger giving way to hurt and confusion. "But I had a right to know. All these years I've wondered about my parents, and my father was right here in town." Pastor David sat across from him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You're right, Isaiah, you did have a right to know. But this situation, it's complicated. Mayor Lopez has his own struggles with this truth." Isaiah's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "He's been wrestling with guilt and fear," Pastor David explained gently. "Coming forward with this truth could have serious consequences for his career and his life. I wanted to give him a chance to do the right thing, to tell you himself." Isaiah was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "So, you were trying to protect both of us?" Pastor David nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I love you like a son, Isaiah. I only wanted what was best for you. Maybe I was wrong to keep it from you even for a short time. Can you forgive me?" Isaiah looked at the man who had raised him, who had been there for every important moment in his life. His anger began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I think I understand. It's just so much to take in." Isaiah sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the worn carpet beneath his feet. Pastor David's words about forgiveness and protection echoed in his mind, mixing with the tumultuous emotions swirling inside him. The shock of discovering Mayor Lopez was his father still felt raw, like an open wound. As the minutes ticked by, Isaiah's breathing slowly steadied. He thought about all the times Pastor David had taught him about forgiveness, about extending grace even when it seemed impossible. Those lessons had always seemed so clear before, but now, faced with this personal challenge, Isaiah found himself struggling. He looked up at Pastor David, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and uncertainty. "You've always taught me about forgiveness," Isaiah said softly. "But it's so hard." Pastor David nodded, his face full of understanding. "Forgiveness is never easy, especially when the hurt runs deep. But it's not about forgetting or excusing what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment." Isaiah pondered these words, his fingers absently tracing the outline of the necklace that had led to this revelation. He thought about Mayor Lopez, a man he had known only as a public figure, now revealed to be his father. The anger he felt was real, but beneath it there was also a flicker of curiosity and a longing he couldn't quite name. Do you think I could ever forgive him?" Isaiah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pastor David leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "That's a decision only you can make, son. But I believe in you. You have a big heart, and you've always been able to see the good in people even when they've made mistakes." Isaiah nodded slowly, feeling the weight of this truth. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine what it would be like to forgive Mayor Lopez. It seemed impossible, and yet. The following day, Mayor Lopez stood at the podium in front of City Hall, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges. A sea of reporters and curious townspeople stretched out before him. their faces a mix of confusion and anticipation. The mayor took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Isaiah, who stood at the back with Pastor David. "Good morning, everyone," Mayor Lopez began, his voice wavering slightly. "I've called this press conference to address a personal matter that has recently come to light. It's a truth I've hidden for far too long, and it's time I take responsibility for my actions." The crowd murmured, sensing the gravity of the moment. Mayor Lopez swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on Isaiah as he continued. 18 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I had a brief relationship with a woman, and when she became pregnant, I chose to walk away. I abandoned her and our unborn child, fearing the impact it would have on my political career. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing the mayor's pained expression. "That child," Lopez said, his voice cracking with emotion, "is Isaiah, a young man who has grown up to be an exemplary member of our community. I want to publicly acknowledge that Isaiah is my son, and express my deepest regret for the years of absence and pain I've caused him." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers and exclamations. Isaiah stood frozen, his face a mix of emotions as he listened to his father's confession. Mayor Lopez continued, his words heavy with remorse. "I know that my actions are unforgivable, but I stand here today to take full responsibility for my past. I failed as a father, and I failed as a man. To Isaiah and to our entire community, I offer my sincerest apologies." As the mayor finished speaking, a hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Then slowly, a smattering of applause began. It grew louder as more people joined in, many moved by the mayor's honesty and vulnerability. Isaiah remained still, his emotions conflicted as he watched the town's reaction. Pastor David placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, offering silent support as they both processed the gravity of the moment. Isaiah sat in the church's small office, his eyes fixed on the television screen as Mayor Lopez's press conference unfolded. Tears streamed down his face, leaving wet trails on his cheeks as he listened to the man who was his biological father pour out his heart to the world. Pastor David sat beside him, a comforting hand on Isaiah's shoulder. The older man's presence was a steady anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm Isaiah. As Mayor Lopez's words filled the room, Isaiah felt his heart twist with a mix of pain, anger, and something else he couldn't quite name. The mayor's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke of his regret and shame, and Isaiah found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word. "I know that my actions are unforgivable," Mayor Lopez said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I stand here today to take full responsibility for my past." Isaiah's breath caught in his throat. He'd spent so many years wondering about his father, imagining who he might be. Never in his wildest dreams had he pictured this scenario. Pastor David squeezed Isaiah's shoulder gently. "Are you okay, son?" he asked softly. Isaiah nodded, unable to speak. His mind was racing, trying to process everything he was hearing and feeling. As the press conference continued, Isaiah found his anger slowly giving way to something else. The raw honesty in Mayor Lopez's words, the genuine remorse in his eyes. It all spoke to something deep within Isaiah's heart. He thought about all the lessons Pastor David had taught him over the years about forgiveness and grace. Isaiah had always found it easy to extend forgiveness to others, but now, faced with this monumental hurt, he realized how truly difficult it could be. Yet, as he watched his father bare his soul to the entire town, Isaiah felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. Maybe forgiveness wasn't out of reach after all. Isaiah took a deep breath as he stood outside Mayor Lopez's office. His heart raced, but he knew this meeting was necessary. With a trembling hand, he knocked on the door. "Come in," Mayor Lopez's voice called from inside. Isaiah stepped into the office, his eyes meeting those of the man he now knew to be his father. The mayor looked tired, the weight of recent events clearly visible on his face. "Isaiah," Lopez said softly, rising from his chair. "Thank you for coming." Isaiah nodded, taking a seat across from the mayor, For a moment, neither spoke, the silence heavy between them. Finally, Isaiah found his voice. I wanted to talk to you about everything that's happened." Mayor Lopez leaned forward, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Of course. I'm here to listen." Isaiah took another deep breath, steadying himself. "What you did, abandoning me, it hurt me deeply. I've spent my whole life wondering about my parents, feeling like there was a piece of me missing." Lopez's eyes welled with tears. "Isaiah, I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't begin to make up for what I did, but—" "Let me finish," Isaiah interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "I want you to understand how much your actions affected me. But I also want to say that I saw your press conference. I saw how you stood up and took responsibility for what you did." Mayor Lopez looked surprised. "You did?" Isaiah nodded. "It took courage to do that, to admit your mistakes in front of everyone, knowing it could cost you everything." "It was the right thing to do," Lopez said quietly. "I should have done it years ago." Isaiah felt a lump form in his throat. "I want you to know that I think forgiveness might be possible, but it's going to take time. I can't just forget everything that's happened." Mayor Lopez nodded, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "I understand, and I'm willing to wait, to do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, but I promise you, Isaiah, I want to be the father you always deserved." Isaiah felt his own eyes begin to water. "I can't promise anything, but I'm willing to try, to see if we can build something." The news of Mayor Lopez's revelation spread through Silver Springs like wildfire. Whispers and hushed conversations could be heard on every street corner and in every shop. The town was abuzz with a mix of shock, disbelief, and curiosity. At first, there was a wave of disappointment and anger directed at Mayor Lopez. Some residents felt betrayed, questioning how they could trust a leader who had kept such a significant secret. However, as the initial shock wore off, the focus of the town began to shift towards Isaiah. Isaiah, who had always been a beloved figure in the community, now found himself at the center of attention. As he walked down the street or volunteered at the community center, he could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him. Some looked at him with pity, others with admiration. To everyone's surprise, Isaiah continued his volunteer work with the same dedication and kindness he had always shown. His unwavering commitment to helping others, even in the face of personal turmoil, touched the hearts of many in Silver Springs. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly owner of the local bakery, approached Isaiah one afternoon as he was helping to organize a food drive. With tears in her eyes, she took his hands in hers and said, "You're a true example of grace, young man. This town is blessed to have you." Her words seemed to open a floodgate. More and more people began to express their support for Isaiah. They saw in him a strength that went beyond his circumstances, a character shaped not by the revelation of his parentage, but by the love and values instilled in him by Pastor David and the community. As the days passed, Isaiah found himself surrounded by an ever-growing circle of support. The very community he had served for so long was now rallying around him, offering words of encouragement and gestures of kindness. Amidst this outpouring of support, Isaiah began to realize something profound. His identity, his worth, was not defined by the circumstances of his birth or the actions of his biological father. Instead, it was shaped by the love he had received from Pastor David, the church community, and the entire town of Silver Springs. On a bright Sunday morning, the church bells rang out across Silver Springs, calling the faithful to worship. Isaiah stood at the entrance, his heart pounding with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Beside him, Mayor Lopez shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence replaced by a humble demeanor. As they stepped into the church together, a hush fell over the congregation. All eyes turned to the father and son, standing side by side for the first time. Pastor David, standing at the pulpit, smiled warmly at them both. "Welcome, brothers and sisters," Pastor David began, his voice filled with emotion. "Today, we witness a miracle of forgiveness and redemption. Let us embrace Isaiah and Mayor Lopez with open hearts." The congregation responded with a chorus of "Amen," and many stood up, applauding softly. Mrs. Santos, the church organist, began to play a gentle hymn, filling the air with soothing melodies. Isaiah and Mayor Lopez made their way down the aisle, finding seats in the front pew. As they sat down, Isaiah felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He glanced at his father, noticing the tears glistening in the mayor's eyes. Throughout the service, Isaiah felt the love and acceptance of the congregation enveloping him like a warm blanket. Pastor David's sermon focused on the power of forgiveness and the strength of family bonds, his words resonating deeply with everyone present. As the service progressed, Isaiah began to feel a profound sense of peace settling over him. The anger and confusion that had plagued him since learning the truth about his father started to melt away, replaced by a growing feeling of acceptance. When it came time for the congregation to greet one another, Isaiah was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love. Church members approached him and Mayor Lopez, offering hugs, handshakes, and words of encouragement. Mrs. Santos, her eyes brimming with tears, embraced Isaiah tightly. "You've always been a blessing to this community, dear," she whispered. "And now, seeing you and your father together, it's a testament to the power of God's love." As the service concluded, Isaiah realized that this moment marked a new chapter in his life. The church that had always been his home now felt even more welcoming, a sanctuary where both he and his father could find acceptance and healing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the peaceful cemetery, Isaiah and Mayor Lopez stood side by side before a simple headstone. The name etched into the cool marble was unfamiliar to Isaiah, yet it held a world of meaning. Maria Johnson, his mother. Isaiah's heart felt heavy as he gazed at the grave, trying to imagine the woman who had brought him into this world. Mayor Lopez, his face etched with sorrow and regret, placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the headstone. "I wish I had known her," Isaiah said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mayor Lopez nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She must have been an incredible woman," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "To have made such a difficult choice out of love for you." They stood in silence for a moment, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of nearby trees. Isaiah felt a strange mix of sadness and gratitude washing over him. Though he had never known his mother, her sacrifice had led him to the loving arms of Pastor David and the church community. Mayor Lopez took a deep breath, his hand moving to the necklace around his neck, the twin to the one Isaiah wore. With trembling fingers, he unclasped it and knelt before the grave. "Maria," he said, his voice quivering, "I can never thank you enough for the gift you've given me." He carefully draped the necklace over the headstone, the metal glinting in the fading sunlight. "Our son is everything I could have hoped for and more." Isaiah watched, deeply moved by his father's gesture. As Mayor Lopez stood, Isaiah reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. No words were needed. The simple touch conveyed forgiveness, understanding, and love. Together, father and son turned away from the grave, their steps slow but sure as they walked towards the cemetery gates. The weight of the past seemed to lift with each step, replaced by a sense of hope for the future they would build together. If you enjoyed the story of Isaiah, Pastor David, and Mayor Lopez, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.